Thank you very much for coming. We're going to start this off, as we've done for many years, by saying the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. Please join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. My name is Joe McQuaid, and I'm the president and proud to be the president of the Nackey Scripps Loeb School. And I want to welcome you, not just to this event, but welcome you to our new home and our new alliance with the New Hampshire Institute of Politics and St. Anselm College. I think it's going to be a bright future, certainly for our school, and hopefully we can lend a few things to Neil Levesque and his fine institute as well. So I want to thank him and President Joseph Favazza of St. Anselm's for being our new host. Thank you is often a overused word and comes off sometime as a bit trite, but please believe me that the Nackey Scripps Loeb School thanks you, thanks the sponsors and your guests for being here today. You encourage us, you sustain us. I also want to thank the teachers at the Nackey Loeb School, some of whom are here, one of whom is still working, taking pictures for us, and he's a teacher at the school, and the volunteers, and the students at the school who bring so much to us. I've said this before, the teachers have a tough time getting the students out of the classroom at the end of the session because the students are here not because it's mandatory, but because they want to learn different things. So I thank them. I thank our school's executive director, Laura Simoes, who's 10 people at once all the time. Her assistant, Linda Walkowitz, who keeps the lights on for us wherever we are. I want to thank Maggie Haberman, our guest speaker today. I turned on TV the other night at 9 o'clock. I was going to check the Philly score and then go to bed because it's late. But I had a hunch because news had come out around 6 o'clock about somebody turning state's evidence in one of the 412 cases against Trump. I turned on CNN, there was Maggie Haberman, not talking hot air, as a lot of them do, but giving facts, first giving kudos to ABC News for getting the scoop, and then tamping a little enthusiasm of people by saying, we don't know exactly what this is and what this proffer of information is going to be. But it's that kind of devotion, or I think Maggie thinks sleep is overrated. So she doesn't indulge in it. But I do want to tell her, wake up, Maggie. We think we have something to say to you. It's late October, and we're really glad you're at our school. That's all I'm doing. Laura would kill me if there was any more. So we want to thank our honoree, Laurie Ortolano, who's here with her husband. There will be a video shortly about why Laurie is getting this award. We also want to thank our judges of the award, several of whom are here. And I want to thank the guy who does the video every year and is over there. And this is not his day job. He runs a newspaper, but he volunteers here, as a lot of people do. And I want to thank you for it. And now I think I'm going to call up Mr. Doug Foley, who, despite his accent, is a real New Hampshire guy now. And he keeps the lights on for us.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. I appreciate the last comment because keeping all the lights on, Linda got all the credit. So thank you for recognizing our group here. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. Eversource has had a tradition since 2003 for this award ceremony, so we do appreciate the opportunity today as well. You know, the Nackey Loeb School of Communication, for everything you do to make the state better and more informed place to live and work, we do thank you. Our company, Eversource, has been a proud sponsor, as I mentioned, of the Loeb Schools since 2003, partnering on the First Amendment Award, an event every year since its inception. We are committed to health and economic well-being of the residents, businesses, and institutions across our service territory. And the school's goal to help people communicate more effectively with the appreciation of the First Amendment grants the right to share their thoughts for all to see and hear is why we keep coming back year after year. We know that people and businesses of our state rely on energy services we provide to power their success. But energy is just one component that contributes to the strong economy and thriving communities. Effective communication and informed individuals are fundamental to the success of any organization. With classes, workshops, and forums that made up widely accessible to any interested Granite Stater, the Loeb School helps people develop strong communication skills and a greater appreciation for the First Amendment that makes them even stronger contributors to the places they live and work and in their communities. The Loeb School leverages our investment through these classes and the trainings to support nonprofits, small businesses, and local governments. And through its new strategic alliance with the New Hampshire Institute of Politics, the educational opportunities for better informed communities will be that much stronger. The First Amendment Award, a distinguished honor in our state celebrating New Hampshire's individuals or group that has advanced or exercised the First Amendment rights in some special or extraordinary way. And it represents the very strong tradition of civic management, civic engagement, as we know for Granite Staters. Congratulations to this year's honoree, Laurie Ortolano, and thanks again to the Loeb School for your invaluable contributions to our state. We look forward to your continued success in advancing educational programs that benefits all of New Hampshire. Thank you, Joe.
It started with just a property assessment that went kind of through the roof when we moved in. It just rocketed. The property was assessed for about $460,000, and then after we bought it, without a new reevaluation being done, it was raised to $700,000.
She was requesting information from the city of Nashua for tax information that they had. They refused to give it to her. They said it was too complicated to present, they couldn't do it, it was too hard, whatever. Being frustrated, she went to court. She went to the Superior Court in Nashua and prevailed against the town, a city. The city then appealed that to the New Hampshire Supreme Court, but she didn't give up. She prevailed in the Supreme Court.
And in Laurie's case, she felt initially like she had to do it because her tax bill went up by $5,000, and she didn't understand why, and she could not get an answer from the city when she asked, and that launched this sort of career of holding Nashua accountable.
I said, well, this just can't be right. I said, so here's the deal. You're doing a new evaluation next year. I'm going to be watching you. I'm going to be watching very closely what goes on here. And I left it at that. In 2018, the new numbers come out, and we get the numbers, and we print out our street, and my husband and I start looking at it, and we were fuming because it was so apparent that the assessment was never correct, and it was still not correct. We were still well above the neighbors.
And she went to the city. She went to the state taxing department. She went everywhere. She does have a willingness to look everywhere. She should have been a reporter, maybe. She really does not give up. And so she went to multiple city offices, to state offices. She did her homework. She found out what she was entitled to. And she figured out how to use the right to know law. And she's brought multiple cases trying to get what some of us would think would be basic information, which is, how did you get to my tax assessment?
It was a pretty severe route she took, very compelling in the sense of doing a lot of extra work, spending thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours to get the information that she should have been provided, clearly, by law.
And I think the information she's been able to get for herself in terms of tax record information is a benefit to everybody. And that's kind of the idea, I think, of Right to Know. When you seek records for yourself, you really are helping your community.
It was disappointing because while I was engaged in trying to get this assessment down, I started doing a lot of research on how they were handling the office and the numbers, and just found a lot of inconsistencies and raised those with the Department of Revenue. And I started looking at some work on specific assessors in there that I thought was just not in compliance with state law. So the DRA took the complaints, they did their own investigation, and they ended up issuing sanctions against Nashua assessors and one of the contractors who did the reevaluation in 2018. So it had impact.
She did not give up on her First Amendment rights. She did not. And I'm sure that a number of people that wouldn't give stuff to her thought she was a pain. And in reading the decision, at least from the Supreme Court decision, she was right. And we're not going to punish people that don't want to just say no and walk away.
They were hoping I'd just go away by ignoring me. You know, if we don't give her answers, she's just going to get tired and leave.
Free speech and redress on grievances. And this is an essential part of the Constitution and very important. We always talk about the free speech aspect, but we don't usually talk about the ability to seek redress for grievances. And this is what happened here. And it was crystal clear what was going on, at least to the courts, both Superior and Supreme.
You know, in so many respects, the city wins by losing slowly because they employ that strategy so heavily.
The citizens' legislature of the state has decided that we want open government. And when government closes up or makes it very difficult, as they did in this case, for people to get the information they should have gotten, it calls for sanctions. And the court did, in fact, give her sanctions.
She's been given attorney fees by the court. She's had multiple victories. Kind of a highlight of this case for me was the trial court said to Nashua, you need to go back to Right to Know law school because you are continually saying no and you're doing so inappropriately.
Government should work for everybody. You shouldn't have to speak the Queen's English or be an engineer or be a data person to have your government respond to your requests.
You and I and everyone else will benefit from the decisions that Laurie Ortolano has gotten from the court. You know, compensation for her attorney fees, clarity that the law does assume we have access to records, reminder that the Constitution in this state says that, and that helps all of us. And so I'm grateful for her that she's gone back and got opinion after opinion where it says, no, this information should be given to you without all of these restrictions. And at this point, Nashua, you need to get some training because it's that important.
Before I invite her up to the stage, along with Greg Sullivan, one of our school founders and one of the judges of this, I want to tell the reporters in the room to watch out, because she was back in court today on one of the things that Nashua still has not given up on. Laurie Ortolano. Down, and you can go over here.
Perfect.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so I have a few minutes to talk, and the way I always do this, because I'm so well trained with board meetings, is I start my stopwatch and time myself for a 3-minute run. And there we go, we're off. Okay, I want to extend thanks to all of you, and thanks to the school and the judges and the First Amendment Award judges for giving me this award. It brings me great joy. Out of all the things I've done, this brings me the most pleasure, because it can't be appealed, and that's really, really great. I'm sure some people wrote to you and wanted you to take it back, but I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad that it's not headed to the Supreme Court. So it really means a lot to me. I never envisioned that I would be doing this work at this point in my life. I really didn't think I would be doing anything with right to know law. When I first started going to the assessing office, I didn't even remember 91A. I used 91A when I was a school board member 25 years earlier. And then I talked to a DRA official, and I don't know what made it click, but he said, well, you know what you got to do, don't you? And it clicked, and I said, oh my gosh, I got to use 91A. He goes, that's right, get going. So those were some good words. So that started the whole process. It's been really challenging in Nashua because the city has been pretty uncooperative when it comes to opening records and allowing our citizens access. Things become very quickly adversarial, and we have to work better and somehow figure out a way to repair that and allow all voices to be heard in the chamber and all information to be accessible to all people who are interested in it. I think it's so important because the world today is so polarizing, and that cancel culture is running high, and that First Amendment is just really essential to make certain we all have a voice. So, all the wins I had ended up on appeal. All 3 have gone up to the Supreme Court, and basically 2 of them have now been taken care of. We've got one being briefed that'll be coming out ready for oral arguments after December. And this whole process really just drives up costs, makes it so expensive and challenging to go on. This work it's tough to find attorneys doing this work. It really is. I was president for a brief period of time for Right to Know New Hampshire, and I had to resign because once I had the 3 appeals filed, I was like, oh, I don't have time to do that job. I have to work on these appeals. And I did 2 of the appeals pro se, which was very frustrating and really stressful because I didn't know what I was doing. So, I didn't want the oral arguments. It turned out the oral arguments were probably the best thing for me. So I'm really glad I did do the oral arguments. What I think is, so this whole thing of driving these things to appeals and taking them into court, it really advantages the city, and they really very quickly get control of your pocketbook. And they make it hard for the lawyers trying to represent you. They want to keep costs under control, but if they're very cooperative, a city, you go back to court over and over again, and all of that is a fee. You can't help it. It's just the way it is. So unfortunately, when I think of what I've accomplished for Nashua, it hasn't been much because they haven't been willing to change their practices, open their doors, open records. But I hope that the work that I've accomplished helps the state, that other communities in the state are able to get records. And, these things change over time. Sometimes it takes a long time, and the pendulum moves slowly. Politics play a role, and then you need to do this type of adjudication, and none of it's really easy. I think that the loss of the newspapers and the active coverage of the media in our board meetings and in our politics down in Nashua has been a big issue. We used to have the Telegraph there and the Union Leader covering board meetings and standing committee meetings so we could be informed, and I read it, but after 2019 into early 2020, that all changed. And, in fact, our Aldermanic Chamber had a press table in the back for both the Telegraph and the Union Leader, and they've now ripped that out. It's just gone. I was sitting at it a little too much when the press wasn't coming, so I came in one day and boom, out the door it had gone. So That has just hurt everyone because we're not as informed by not having newspaper coverage. The technology and computer methods and media and TikTok videos and all are great for a certain crowd, but Nashua, New Hampshire does have an aging older population where I think a paper is still very essential, online or paper form, and that coverage, that media coverage of your local government is really important, and we're missing it now. So it's given the city an attitude or a confidence to say, let's see what we can get away with, which makes it very important for us citizens to actively look at what's going on to try and stop what's happening there and what they're getting away with. So, and that's difficult. You know, I would like to see some changes. The courts, I think, bringing these issues forward to court has been really interesting because the courts, one, they're burdened. They're burdened with important issues that involve crime and, you know, corporate issues, and then you come in with your right to know case, and every one of them is a little different for the information you're looking at. So even though these petitions are priority matter, the courts have had a hard time treating them like priority matters because they just don't have the resources in the courts to do this kind of work. And I think we have to improve on the process on how these are taken through court. I have been a really strong spokesperson for the Ombudsman Office, and I gave testimony up in Concord on that, and I believe very strongly that that's a real positive for the state to have a low-cost mechanism for citizens to bring an issue forward. But that group is in its infancy. They're just developing their rules, and for me, given the nature of the people in Nashua and the way they go at it in a very attacking, personal way, I would not want to bring these issues up to the Ombudsman Office. I don't want to sabotage them, quite frankly. I want them to get off the ground and get their footing. I wouldn't wish a tackle with some of our city people on anyone. So I've kept it into the courts, and someday maybe I'll be able to access the Ombudsman. But right now, I'm kind of waiting to see how that all works out. I'd like to see more people step up to do this work, and I know it's risky. It's risky work now. It's become more risky than ever because there's so many built-in personal attacks that come down on you when you do this work, and because that's the nature of the world right now. So I think it's hard for younger people to do this work because their reputations are important in their careers and their families, and I don't like to see people getting hurt who are trying to just get records open, and that has happened in Nashua to young people, and it makes me feel really badly, and it's made me stick with my cases because what I've seen happen to 35-year-old people who stepped up. So us older people need to do some more. We can take the kick, and we're not going to lose all our finances for it. So, you know, this kind of volunteer work has a benefit. So, you know, again, I want to thank the First Amendment Board and the judges for awarding me with this. I'm really so grateful for this. It really does mean a lot to me. It's very special, and I want to thank my husband and all of my friends who've been so supportive. Laura here has just been, she's my editor, catches all my spelling mistakes, and I'm a terrible speller, so you would not believe. And she keeps saying, Laurie, you typed trail again. It's trial. So, stupid little things that go on. So Laura has been just so helpful, and my neighbors have been helpful, and I've met really wonderful people in the city, and while, you know, my officials may not be thrilled with me, I feel like there's a lot of citizen support there, and I'm grateful for it. So thank you very much.
Very impressive, and it's wonderful to hear the inspiring stories of, I think of things that actually uniquely happen in New Hampshire, where it is small enough to be important and to actually take action. Good afternoon, I'm Howard Brodsky, and I'm chairman of CCA Global Partners and co-founder of the Brodsky Prize for Excellence in Student Journalism. Today, I'll be introducing you to our featured speaker. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, we codify a free press. A free press is essential to a healthy democracy, one where accurate, factual information drives civic participation. The next generation of journalists is out there now in our schools, learning and looking for us to help support them to ensure a strong future. In that spirit, my son Jeff and I established the Brodsky Prize to honor excellence in student journalism. The Brodsky Prize is proud to sponsor of the First Amendment Award. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to explain why this was so meaningful to my son Jeff. In 1990, Jeff was a junior at Manchester Central High School and co-editor of their very famous paper, actually the Manchester Little Green newspaper, with Misbah Tahir, the two co-editors-in-chief. The newspaper wanted to cover the freshman elections, and the freshman elections were published, but the school would not publish the actual vote count of the elections. And my son, Jeff, challenged that and said, why don't you publish the vote count? And they said, because we don't want to. And he wrote a strong editorial about the lack of transparency and freedom of information as the backbone of democracy. As you might expect, the principal did not like this. The principal took and said to Jeff and Misbah, I want an official apology in front of the entire school. They were intimidated, and they first did it. And then he said, I don't think everybody heard it. And they said, we're not doing it again. He came home, and as you can imagine as a parent, being challenged with the principal, we're slightly concerned. But the principal took the computers, locked them up from the Little Green newspaper, locked the doors to the Little Green newspaper. Very fortunately, the union leader covered the event and had an article on the front page of the union leader. The event actually made national news and was actually eventually in 2 books was published about it. Due to the external pressure by the union leader, the paper was eventually reopened, thank God. We lost Jeff this past year. You can read more about him in your program book, but I can tell you his light continues to shine brightly. But in his memory, we continue with the Brodsky Prize, which will celebrate the rights we have which in First Amendment, which Jeff taught us about through his work and service. And I have the pleasure today of introducing you to our guest speaker. Maggie Haberman is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. She is a senior political correspondent for the New York Times and a frequently seen political analyst for CNN. I see her on the TV all the time. We watch you. She continues to cover Donald Trump and politics in Washington and has authored the best-selling book, Confidence Man, The Making of Donald Trump and the Breaking of America, which you'll see around the room today. In reviewing this book, Joe Klein said, Haberman is famously formidable, and the Guardian newspaper called her the Trump Whisperer. And the Washington Post read, later generations of historians will puzzle over Trump's rise to national power. The best of them will have learned from Haberman's book. I'm delighted to welcome Maggie Haberman.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you for having me here today. I feel compelled to say 2 things. I hate the term Trump whisperer, so I'll just say that out at the outset, because I think it conveys an impression that isn't quite accurate. And it's been 20 years since I first came to New Hampshire to, in earnest, report on the primaries. Back then it was Howard Dean's last stand against John Kerry. And I have to say, and I'm embarrassed that I haven't been up here this cycle until now, but I've been covering the investigations into Trump more than I have the activities of candidates, because bluntly, there hasn't been much of an engaged primary race. I can't remember it feeling less like it's political season than it does right now, and I assume that is true for people who are here day to day. The topic of this moment is the First Amendment. I want to echo what has been said about the importance of a free press, and certainly what Laurie said, and congratulations to Laurie, about the attriting and loss of local media, which has been terrible for accountability, for government accountability, because it is vitally important in local communities. I don't know what solves it or what fixes it, but if I think of, when I think of various threats around the country, the loss of local journalism is one of them. So I was given pretty broad guidance by Joe on what to talk about, so I'm going to talk pretty broadly about a variety of things, and I hope I won't bore you. But I'm here at a moment where freedom of the press as a term is actually being used as a political weapon in a lot of contexts by people who don't like what we do and don't want us to report on them and say it derisively. So I want to talk about how I do my job, what I'm covering, and how the issue of First Amendment rights factors into some of the Trump investigations. This is the state that more or less validated that Donald Trump was a force in our political system when he won the primary here in February 2016, a force that I think has proven more durable than many people foresaw at the time, myself included. And it's been nearly 3 years since Trump left office, 2 weeks after a mob of his supporters attacked the Capitol building on January 6th, 2021, as the Electoral College victory of President Biden was being certified, and the prediction by many pre-Trump era Republicans that Trump would fade from interest and fade from the stage just did not come to pass. And in part that was because some prominent Republicans, notably Kevin McCarthy, who would become Speaker earlier this year with Donald Trump's semi-help, and then not Speaker more recently, for a variety of reasons, flew to Mar-a-Lago shortly after Trump left office to try to appease him, to keep him from attacking the Republican House members. Senator Rick Scott, then leading the NRSC, the Republican Senate campaign arm, flew to Florida to do the same thing a few months later. They were not the only reason that Trump had durability, and the reality is that Trump threw accelerant on existing trends of partisanship, anti-establishmentism, and mistrust in institutions that had been brewing for decades and only increased after the fiscal crisis of 2008 and the election of the country's first black president. Trump has largely transformed the party and his image, although I think we're going to find out how much that's true when the votes start getting cast in these primaries. And it was something that he was uniquely positioned to do, thanks to demagoguery and his celebrity status and his fusion with the pop culture fabric for decades. That's sort of only clear looking back at what happened in recent history, and I do that in the book that I wrote about him. And to that end, back to why I'm here and what I do. For 4 years, I covered the Trump White House primarily from a desk in Midtown Manhattan, which was not ideal, but I could not move to Washington when he was elected. I have 3 kids and I have a husband. I run around a lot. I had a yogurt explosion on my blazer this morning, which, is why it looks half white. I do all the things a normal person does who is trying to live a life. And then Trump won, and I think all of our expected ensuing months were upended in our plans. And I had a fairly traditional career before Trump became president, although I fell into reporting by accident. I had studied fiction writing when I was at Sarah Lawrence College, and then I tried getting hired at magazines after I graduated, and it was very bracing. I had one interview after another, and I couldn't get a job. No one would hire me. This was 1996. And I heard about a clerk opening at the New York Post, where I went to work in August of 1996, shuffling faxed press releases to the city desk inbox and sorting mail. And Jonathan Karl, who's now at ABC, had just left the paper, and a lot of his mail needed to be dealt with. Running the page proofs of the next day's paper, and once a week getting sent out on general assignment. And I was born and raised in New York City, but as a reporter in training for a tabloid, I was experiencing the city in a way I never had before. Becoming a journalist will let you experience your community in a way that you never would have otherwise. And what that meant working for a tabloid was a lot of crime coverage and a lot of hard and searing interpersonal interactions. So one was getting into a hospital and speaking to a man who was there, who had just lost his pregnant wife and one of his children to a hit-and-run driver. I unfortunately reached the roommate of a subway pushing victim before the police did, and I was the one who delivered the news of her friend's death. I talked to the wife of a bus driver who had been driving a bus that skidded off a New Jersey highway on a holiday night, driving to Atlantic City, leaving several people dead. And on the advice of a skilled general assignment reporter I was working with, I would scan the eyes of bystanders crowded around a crime scene, looking for the telltale signs of a witness. But at the same time, since the pay was quite low, I was working nights as a bartender, and it was actually some of the best training one could have as a journalist. That's not an alcohol joke. It taught me about dealing with people. It taught me about approaching. You have to approach anyone who comes and sits in front of you. And I learned to ask questions, even when it seemed like I had run out of things to ask. And I had the luck of getting assigned by the Metro editor to work as an intern for Jack Newfield, a famous muckraking journalist whose 10 Worst Judges lists at the Village Voice set the tone for a type of accountability journalism, holding jurists whose records often escape notice or critical looks to the standards of the bench. 2 decades earlier, Jack was working with a protege named Wayne Barrett, and he told Wayne to go cover a real estate developer and political chit-gatherer named Donald Trump, who he said he ought to focus on as somebody who was trying to figure out how to amass power in New York City. And Wayne did. Now, Jack taught me lessons that shaped my career going forward, but two stand out today in the context of this current moment. And one is that you really cannot cover someone or something you hate. It does, as a straight news journalist, it is just not something you can do. And you cannot give in to bullying from the powerful as you pursue a story. He taught me the second one when we worked together on a 10 Worst Judges list when we were at the Post. He got a call from a district attorney he knew well who was concerned about one of the judges on the list and wanted that person taken off. And the DA warned Jack that he would, quote, lose all access to this office if he persisted with the reporting. Now, this was a new experience for me. I was 25, and I was nervous when Jack told me about this. And I asked him, what would we do? And he said, we leave the judge in. You can't give in to that kind of intimidation. And we didn't. And the judge stayed on the list. The DA in question cut Jack off for a while, but eventually came back around. And it taught me a key lesson that as bad as things seem in the moment and as hard as they seem when you're reporting, they calm down. People calm down. Situations calm down, even if it seems like they're not going to. I became a full-time reporter in 1998, and I was sent to City Hall the next year when Rudy Giuliani was mayor. And in the second year of his final term, I had no idea what I was doing. Realistically, I had no business being there, but I watched and I learned. And I tried to outwork my competitors and my colleagues, and I responded to calls from sources at all hours of the night. I met with anyone who was willing to get coffee with me. I discovered the almost fanatical devotion that reporters at the tabloids had to their respective papers during what was one of the great newspaper rivalries of all time, the New York Daily News and the New York Post. The New York Daily News no longer has a newsroom. It is basically just digital, and the New York Post has shrunk to something very different. Giuliani, as mayor, would hold 3 press conferences a day sometimes. He was almost always confrontational, never wanted to avoid reporters. This was my first experience covering a politician, and I didn't realize that this is not only rare, but fairly New York specific or big city specific. The world changed on September 11th, 2001. I was in Lower Manhattan when the second Twin Tower collapsed, and I ran up Church Street in Lower Manhattan with a group of people away from the noise after a police van pulled up and blared over their loudspeaker that if we didn't want to get hurt, we had to evacuate. And I spent the next 3 years covering rebuilding of the World Trade Center site, which meant tracing a tangle of government agencies, all of which wanted a piece of the land and the process, and none of which wanted the responsibility for the disappointment that a very large group of relatives of those who had been killed in the attacks were likely to have with whatever redesign they chose. And there was an election that year in New York City that turned out completely differently than people had expected. It was the race to replace Giuliani, and at the time it looked certain to be a Democrat named Mark Green. The landscape changed on 9/11. Giuliani, who had been unbelievably unpopular on September 10th, suddenly was a valuable endorsement, and Green flailed around, lobbying attacks against his rival, Mike Bloomberg, which ended up hurting Green in the process. Now, Bloomberg won by a relatively small margin, but it was historic for a Republican to win right after a Republican in a city where the registration is overwhelmingly Democratic. And it was another important lesson, and my first, that it's a good reminder that all the punditing in the world doesn't necessarily show where voters are, and why you never stop covering a campaign as it's ongoing. I joined Politico in 2010 and tried to mine the contacts that I had made over a decade in New York politics to establish myself as a national political reporter. And I really struggled at it. I had difficulty adjusting my aperture from what made sense in New York to what would be of interest across the country, particularly working for a publication that was focused on the inside political game. I had had some experience with national politics, but it's very limited when you're working for a local paper. There were some moments of crossover, though. One came in February 2011 when I spoke to Roger Stone, a political operative, notorious really everywhere at that point, as a dirty trickster who sometimes took credit for things he hadn't done, about a potential Donald Trump campaign for president. Now, I knew that other Trump advisors from New York or other people I knew from New York were advising Trump quietly, and I knew that Stone was part of those meetings, so at my editor's urging, I did an interview with him where he talked about what a Trump campaign would look like. And he went on at length. Everything he said holds up pretty well in terms of what a Trump candidacy would look like, but there was a big picture of Stone front and center. And he said he was not officially working for Trump. I get a statement the next day from Trump's office saying that Stone isn't advising him. And then as I'm reading the statement, I get a phone call from Trump's assistant, Rona Graff, who connected me to Trump. And Trump says, "Roger Stone doesn't speak for me." And this was a very early window into the disorienting sensation that's become familiar for journalists seeking to cover baseline reality around a lot of what Trump says and does. Based on my reporting, Stone was telling me the truth about where things were. Trump was not. And it was another educational moment. And Trump did not run that year. After promoting a lie about President Obama's birthplace for several weeks, he announced during Sweeps Week for The Apprentice that he would not begin a real campaign. And the basic reaction from the political world was, we knew it. We knew he would not run. And we knew this was a fake. And I had been getting a lot of grief from people for having treated this remotely seriously. I will point out that after Trump started spreading a lie about President Obama's birthplace, his numbers went up in the polls very dramatically in the Republican primary polls. So 4 years later, I got a call from a different aide to Trump, a young man named Sam Nunberg, who many of you may have seen on TV at various points. And by then I was at the Times, a paper that Trump has been obsessed with for a variety of reasons for decades. Sam told me, "Trump is going to declare on June 16th, and we want you to break it." And I said no. And when he asked for an explanation, I said I was not writing a word about Trump until he actually ran because of what he had done in 2011. Now, in hindsight, that was not my sharpest call, but it was very defendable, and it's one I would do again. Trump had considered running for president so many times before and kept his name in the press so many times before that I didn't want to be used, but my gut was also not especially instructive or helpful in that moment because he did run. He capitalized on endless airtime from television networks that outdid one another to get him on air. And what he had done by then was figured out what he hadn't figured out in 2011, which was how to make the national press play by tabloid rules. In New York, he was very good at making himself a commodity to one paper to make the other paper want to reach out to him. And it was clear to me that he had figured this out when the television station started letting him call into interviews. He didn't even have to leave Trump Tower anymore. He would just phone in. These networks are not far from Trump Tower. They're in Midtown. He could get there pretty easily. In New York City over many decades, the view of Trump was as a tabloid sensation and a gossip page fixture, a vulgar real estate developer, a self-promoter, who had been through casino bankruptcies, 2 divorces, the details of which, in one case, he personally leaked to the tabloids. But outside of the 5 boroughs, I came to discover in 2015 the view of him was largely based on his decade-plus years on the series The Apprentice. When I went to visit Iowa to cover Trump rallies, I was told by voters that he was a self-made man, a successful business leader, an innovator. And the line between news and entertainment is not as clear for people outside of the news business, and those trips to Iowa really reinforced that. I went, and I write about this in my book, but I went to an airplane hangar rally of his in Dubuque, Iowa, a couple of nights before the caucuses, and I asked a very leading question, which was, of several people, are you here because this is the last time you're going to see him? And one guy looked at me like I had 8 heads and said he was going to caucus for him, and when I said why, he said I watched him run his business. And he meant The Apprentice. So, you know, it was becoming clear that what we were writing was not breaking through this about sort of who Trump is. And there are, he does have actual accomplishments, but they're just not commensurate with how he describes himself. It was clear that it didn't matter because people had made up their minds based on other information. I spent much of 2021 and 2022 working on this book about Trump, which I hope you will read. If you haven't already, I apologize for how heavy it is. Don't drop it on your foot. It's not just about the presidency, but about the world he came from and how that shaped him, and in so many ways meant the contours of his presidency were predetermined before he got there. He is a former president and current political candidate whose preference is for conflict, and who has been using increasingly apocalyptic rhetoric around the country. The book references an early scene of him as a 5-year-old being said to have thrown rocks at the crib of a neighbor baby in an adjacent yard. And I was asked a question in the last 2 days whether I think it's apocryphal or not. I do not think it's apocryphal. Now, it was told to me by the baby, who is obviously now a grown man, who was told it by his mother. But I think that Trump has long been fascinated by violence, and I think that's really pretty documented. And I think it is important to bear in mind at a moment when we are seeing threats of violence overtake our political discourse in a way that I don't remember seeing ever in modern history, in the US anyway. Now, one thing I spent a great deal of time on while I was researching the book was the way news articles about Trump consistently over decades served as bricks in a broader artifice that he was creating about himself. He realized the artifice mattered much more than the reality. In the journalism business, we focus on the reality. And he was often described, just on a simplistic level, he was often described as a mogul. He was not a mogul, he was a real estate developer. He wanted to be seen as a mogul. And often these articles reflected the way in which he wanted to be seen. And yet, decades later, Trump is unusually expert at figuring out ways to insert himself into the press. And we've seen it repeatedly over time. Someone close to him said to me in 2015 during that primary race, and it was after he had made what many Republicans perceived as an error. I don't remember what it related to. I think it related to a terrorist attack. This person said they'd never seen, I'm paraphrasing to get rid of the colorful language, but that they had never seen somebody screw up and have their poll numbers go up. And that was what happened over and over again. Now, the loss in 2020 showed that he's not immune to political gravity. At the same time, he brought out a lot of new voters who had never voted before in a presidential race, and he has done that in both of his races. These days, the bulk of the coverage of Trump is about the criminal and civil cases he's facing in a range of investigations and civil cases. And so I just want to take a minute to talk about what's happening with them. He is facing 7 different cases in 6 courthouses in 4 different cities. He's also the front runner for the presidency for the Republicans by a very wide mile. He spent yesterday in a Manhattan state court, which he didn't need to attend, but he chose to. It's a civil case. He won't have to be there until there's a criminal case. And he did it so that he could stare down his former fixer and lawyer, Michael Cohen, who is the star, he's actually debatably the star witness, it depends on who you talk to, in this case by the New York Attorney General against Trump that could practically, depending on how this turns out, essentially unwind the Trump organization and make it close to defunct. In the process of attending, he said something that the judge in the case felt violated a gag order that he'd previously imposed and fined him $10,000. elsewhere, prosecutors in D.C., federal prosecutors, were again approaching a judge about focusing on their perception that the conditions of Trump's release were too lenient because Trump continues to attack people connected to the case. And in that case, we're talking about the January 6th case. There's a separate federal case which is being heard in Florida. What this looks like practically could mean a front-running candidate who is in court for significant portions of next year having to sit as a defendant. I think it's hard to imagine that all of these trials will happen next year. It's actually hard to imagine that more than 2 will happen next year. But 2 is not nothing, and then there's an additional 2 civil trials in January. And what this has looked like over and over again, to the point of that advisor made to me in 2015, saying that they'd never seen somebody mess up and have their poll numbers go up, is that Trump's support has solidified among Republicans every time he's been indicted. And so I think an area of reporting that I would really like to see more of everywhere is about the appetite among voters for Trump and how they describe that, as opposed to the mere fact that it exists. Trump's folks are arguing, and his lawyers are arguing, that his First Amendment rights are being challenged with these gag orders. I don't think any judge is implementing a gag order lightly against a front-running political candidate. But he is challenging the system in a way that we've just never experienced, and I don't, frankly, know what it all leads to, other than that he has a very long history of testing the boundaries for as long as he can, until there's some reason for him to stop, be it a financial obligation like a fine that he doesn't want to pay or the threat of jail. And the judge in the New York case threatened him with jail. And again, that would be extremely complicated to imagine, somebody with a Secret Service detail going to jail, but this is where thinking needs to be right now. So with that, I told you it would be broad, but it did touch on the First Amendment several times. And I really appreciate you having me up here. Thank you.
I think the school's executive director wants to say a few words to you, and I want to thank her again for what you've done, Laura.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. I'm Laura Simoes. I'm the executive director of the Nackey Loeb School of Communications. So delighted to have you all here. My job is only just to offer thanks. So thank you so much. Congratulations, Laurie, on your honor. Thank you to Maggie for being here with us. You'll see copies of Maggie's book around the room. These are gifts for you for being here. What I ask is, if you want to leave right away, please take a couple donuts with you. But there are books out by the door, and you're welcome to take one. If you'd like to stay and have your book signed by Maggie, you can come over here to this side of the room. And I want also to thank our donors, our supporters, our sponsors, the people who make our mission possible through their donations. Thank you so much to our partners. One of our partners, the Concord Community Television, is here with us to film this, and for the past couple of years has been a partner in that. We're so grateful to them, and thank you, Josh. I want to say thank you to our students and instructors, some of whom are in the room with us today. Laurie is actually a former student of ours here at the Loeb School. And I want to say how excited I am about our new strategic alliance here at the Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College. It is thrilling to be in this space and to be partnering in a new way, and I want to thank the ambassadors, the student ambassadors who are here today to help us out. We're also really grateful to those of you who come time and again to support us in so many different ways. Our mission is more important than ever, and we are dedicated and committed to continuing this. 2024 will be our 25th anniversary as a school, and each year brings us new clarity about what we are to other people and what we need to be moving forward. I think we're needed more than ever in a state and in a country that is experiencing a lack of trust in fact-based journalism, an increase in violence and mistreatment of journalists, shrinking newsrooms like those that you heard about today, the proliferation of misinformation, a growing awareness of the role of education in civic participation, the increases in technology, which are bringing AI even closer to replicating the kind of human-centered creativity that we have known up to this point, and the deep need for improved communication skills, which build economic and service opportunities for all of us. We also are feeling a need for increased civil dialogue in our communities, something that you also heard about today. So the Nackey Scripps Loeb School is poised to move into the next 25 years with your help and your participation. I hope that you'll join us. We're so much better with your support. And thank you again for being here. I hope you have a lovely evening. Take care.